In this video we learn how to find percentages without a calculator. So a percentage is simply a fraction of 100. So for example 5% would just be 5 divided by 100. So to find a percentage of another quantity, so for example 10% of £20, we would start by writing 10% as a fraction, and then we would simply multiply that by 20. That's what off means. It just means times 20. Sorry about my handwriting, by the way. So off £20. So 10% would be 10 over 100, and then we would just do times 20. So that becomes 1 over 10 times 20, and that would become 20 over 10, which is just £2. And if you don't know how to multiply numbers and fractions, by the way, I've got a video on that. I think it's called Awesome Fractions Trick or something. So it basically consists of writing 20 as 20 over 1, and then you just multiply the two fractions. And there are other ways of doing it. So you can just do times by the top, divide by the bottom, for example. That's another way. Okay, let's try finding 7% of £15 this time. So 7% is 7 over 100 times 15. So that would become 105 over 100. And that simplifies to give 1.05. So in other words, £1, 5 pence. Okay, what about 21% of £35? So that would be 21 over 100 times 35, and that gives, so let's just do that quickly. So 35 times 21, so that would become, so carry the 1, just put that here, and then that would become 7. So that would be 735, and then we just divide that by 100. So 735 over 100, and that gives £7 and 35 pence. Okay, what about percentages involving decimals? So for example, how would we find 11.5% of something? So 11.5% of £11, let's say. So as before, we would start by writing the percentage as a fraction, so that would be 11.5 over 100, and then times £11. And then there's a nice trick you can use to simplify a percentage like this, where you have a decimal number. And the idea is that we're trying to get rid of the decimal in the numerator. So we would just multiply both numbers by 10, or the appropriate power of 10, to get rid of the decimal. So if we multiply 11.5 by 10, that would move the point once to the right, and then that would leave us with a whole number. And then the 100 would just become 1,000. And the reason for that, by the way, the reason these fractions are the same is because they're equivalent fractions. So as you might know from basic work on fractions, if you have a fraction and then you multiply both numbers by the same number, so times 5 for example, that would give you an equivalent fraction. And then to get from this to the original fraction, you can just simplify by dividing both numbers by 5. So that would be equivalent to this fraction, and then you would just carry on as usual. So 115 times 11, that would give, so 115 times 10 is 1150, and then times 1 is 115, so that would be 1150 plus 115, which is simply 1265. So we would get 1265 over 1,000, and that would become £1.27 to 2 decimal places, because you can't have 3 decimal places in a currency. So that's one way of doing these kinds of decimal percentages. And the other way, so I'll just write the question again, 11.5% of £11. So the other way would be to find 1% to begin with. And to find 1%, we just divide by 100, because 1% is 1 over 100. And then if you multiply by 1 over 100, that's the same as dividing by 100. So if we divide £11 by 100, that would give us 0.11, or just 11 pence, 0.11 pounds, which is 11 pence. So that would be 1, and then we would divide that by 2 to get 0.5%. So that would be 0.055 pounds. I'll just do it in pence because I think that's easier. So 11 pence divided by 2, that would be 5.5 pence. But obviously you can't have a decimal amount of pence, so that would be 6 pence. Or we can just write 5.5 for the time being, and then we can round at the end. So that would be 5.5 pence. And that means that 1.5% would just be 1% plus 0.5%. So that would be 11 pence plus 5.5 pence, which is 16.5 pence. And then 10%, so I'll just write that here, so 10%, that would be 11 divided by 10. So that would be £1.10. And then we would just add these two quantities together. So 10% plus 1.5% would give us 11.5%. So 11.5% equals 1.1 plus 16.5 pence, so that would be 0.165, and that would be 1.265, which is £1.27 as before. So this approach is basically, it involves breaking down the percentage, the composite percentage, if you will, into simpler percentages that can be worked out using basic fractions. So 1% is dividing by 100, for example, 10% is dividing by 10, and 0.5%, you just get that from 1% by halving that. And then you would just add up the separate percentages to make up the composite percentage. And this approach is more I prefer this approach, to be honest, because it's just more straightforward and it works for any similar type of question. You don't need to think about, how do I break down 11.5%? You can just go ahead and use the same approach that you used for these simpler kinds of percentages. Okay, let's do a few more, maybe one or two more examples of finding decimal percentages without a calculator. So let's try finding 2.3% of 3.5. So 2.3% is just 2.3 over 100, and then we multiply that by 3.5. And then, as before, we're trying to get rid of the decimal point in the numerator, so we would just multiply by 10. So that would become 23 over 1,000 multiplied by 3.5. And then we would just multiply 23 and 3.5. So 35, 23, so that would become So that would become 805, and then you just move the point once to get 3.5. So you just move it once to the left. So that would be 80.5. So 80.5 over 1,000, and that becomes 0.0805, which is, so this isn't a currency, so I guess you can just leave it like this, so that would be the answer. Or if you wanted to round it, you could round it to, let's say, 2 decimal places, so that would be 0.08 to 2 decimal places. Okay, let's do one more example. Let's try finding 91.15% of £5. So that would be 91.15 over 100 times 5. And then this time we would have to multiply by 100 to get rid of the decimal point, because we need to move it twice to the right this time. So we just multiply both numbers by 100, so that would be 9,115 over 10,000 times 5. And then we just go ahead and multiply 9,115 by 5. So that would be 45,575 divided by 10,000, and that becomes, so we just move the point 4 times to the left, so that becomes 4.5575. So in pounds that would be 4.56 or £4.56. And that would be the answer.